Left-wing communism, an infantile disorder. Section. No compromises. In the quotation from the Frankfurt pamphlet, we have seen how emphatically the lefts have advanced this slogan. It is sad to see people who no doubt consider themselves Marxists and want to be Marxists forget the fundamental truths of Marxism. This is what Engels, who, like Marx, was one of those rarest of authors whose every sentence in every one of their fundamental works contains a remarkably profound content, wrote in 1874 against the manifesto of the 33 Blanquist communards. Beginning of quote. We are communists, the Blanquist communards wrote in their manifesto, because we want to attain our goal without stopping at intermediate stations, without any compromises, which only postpone the day of victory and prolong the period of slavery. Quote continued. The German communists are communists because, through all the intermediate stations and all compromises created, not by them, but by the course of historical development, they clearly perceive and constantly pursue the final aim, the abolition of classes, and the creation of a society in which there will no longer be private ownership of land or of the means of production. The 33 Blanquists are communists just because they imagine that, merely because they want to skip the intermediate stations and compromises, the matter is settled. And if it begins in the next few days, which they take for granted, and they take over power, communism will be introduced the day after tomorrow. If that is not immediately possible, they are not communists. What childish innocence it is to present one's own impatience as a theoretically convincing argument. End of quote. From Frederick Engels, Program of the Blanquist Communards. In the same article, Engels expresses his profound esteem for Vaillant, and speaks of the, quote, unquestionable merit of the latter, who, like Gesde, was one of the most prominent leaders of international socialism until their betrayal of socialism in August 1914. But Engels does not fail to give a detailed analysis of an obvious error. Of course, to very young and inexperienced revolutionaries, as well as to petty bourgeois revolutionaries of even a very respectable age and great experience, it seems extremely, quote, dangerous, incomprehensible, and wrong to, quote, permit compromises. Many sophists, being unusually or excessively experienced politicians, reason exactly in the same way as the British leaders of opportunism mentioned by Comrade Lansbury. Quote, if the Bolsheviks are permitted to a certain compromise, why should we not be permitted any kind of compromise? End quote. However, proletarians schooled in numerous strikes, to take only this manifestation of the class struggle, usually assimilate in admirable fashion the very profound truth, philosophical, historical, political, and psychological, expounded by Engels. Every proletarian has been through strikes and has experienced compromises with the hated oppressors and the exploiters, when the workers have had to return to work either without having achieved anything, or else agreeing to only a partial satisfaction of their demands. Every proletarian, as a result of the conditions of the mass struggle and the acute intensification of class antagonisms he lives among, sees the difference between a compromise enforced by objective conditions, such as lack of strike funds, no outside support, starvation, and exhaustion. A compromise which in no way minimizes the revolutionary devotion and readiness to carry on the struggle on the part of the workers who have agreed to such a compromise. And, on the other hand, a compromise by traitors who try to ascribe to objective causes their self-interest. Strikebreakers also enter into, quote, compromises. Their cowardice, desire to yield to the capitalists, and readiness to yield to intimidation, sometimes to persuasion, sometimes to sops, sometimes to flattery from the capitalists. The history of the British labor movement provides a very large number of instances of such treacherous compromises by British trade union leaders. But, in one form or another, almost all workers in all countries have witnessed the same sort of thing. Naturally, there are individual cases of exceptional difficulty and complexity. When the greatest efforts are necessary for a proper assessment of the actual character of this or that compromise. Just as there are cases of homicide when it is by no means easy to establish whether the homicide was fully justified and even necessary, as, for example, legitimate self-defense, or due to unpardonable negligence, or even to a cunningly executed perfidious plan. Of course, in politics, where it is sometimes a matter of extremely complex relations, national and international, between classes and parties, very many cases will arise that will be much more difficult than the question of a legitimate compromise in a strike or a treacherous compromise by a strike breaker, treacherous leader, etc. It would be absurd to formulate a recipe or general rule, quote, no compromises, to suit all cases. One must use one's own brains and be able to find one's bearings in each particular instance. It is, in fact, one of the functions of a party organization and of party leaders worthy of the name, to acquire, through the prolonged, persistent, variegated, and comprehensive efforts of all thinking representatives of a given class, the knowledge, experience, and, in addition to knowledge and experience, the political flair necessary for the speedy and correct solution of complex political problems. Naive and quite inexperienced people imagine that the permissibility of compromise in general is sufficient to obliterate any distinction between opportunism, against which we are waging, and must wage, an unremitting struggle, and revolutionary Marxism or communism. But if such people do not know yet that in nature and in society all distinctions are fluid and up to a certain point conventional, nothing can help them but lengthy training, education, enlightenment, and political and everyday experience. In the practical questions that arise in the politics of any particular or specific historical moment, it is important to single out those which display the principal type of intolerable and treacherous compromises, such as embody an opportunism that is fatal to the revolutionary class, and to exert all efforts to explain them and combat them. During the 1914-18 imperialist war between two groups of equally predatory countries, social chauvinism was the principal and fundamental type of opportunism, i.e., support of, quote, defense of country, which in such a war was really equivalent to defense of the predatory interests of one's own bourgeoisie After the war, defense of the robber League of Nations, defense of direct or indirect alliances with the bourgeoisie of one's own country against the revolutionary proletariat, and the Soviet movement, and defense of bourgeois democracy and bourgeois parliamentarism against Soviet power, became the principal manifestations of those intolerable and treacherous compromises, whose sum total constituted an opportunism fatal to the revolutionary proletariat and its cause. Quote, all compromise with other parties, any policy of maneuvering and compromise, must be emphatically rejected, the German lefts write in the Frankfurt pamphlet. It is surprising that, with such views, these lefts do not emphatically condemn Bolshevism. After all, the German lefts cannot but know that the entire history of Bolshevism, both before and after the October Revolution, is full of instances of changes of tack, conciliatory tactics, and compromises with other parties, including bourgeois parties. To carry on a war for the overthrow of the international bourgeoisie, a war which is 100 times more difficult, protracted, and complex than the most stubborn of ordinary wars between states, and to renounce in advance any change of tack, or any utilization of a conflict of interests, even if temporary, among one's enemies, or any conciliation or compromise with possible allies, even if they are temporary, unstable, vacillating, or conditional allies. Is that not ridiculous in the extreme? Is it not like making a difficult ascent of an unexplored and hitherto inaccessible mountain, and refusing in advance ever to move in zigzags, ever to retrace one's steps, or ever to abandon a course once selected and to try others? And yet people so immature and inexperienced, if youth were the explanation, it would not be so bad. Young people are preordained to talk such nonsense for a certain period, have met with support, whether direct or indirect, open or covert, whole or partial, it does not matter, from some members of the Communist Party of Holland. After the first socialist revolution of the proletariat and the overthrow of the bourgeoisie in some country, the proletariat of that country remains for a long time weaker than the bourgeoisie, simply because of the latter's extensive international links, and also because of the spontaneous and continuous restoration and regeneration of capitalism and the bourgeoisie by the small commodity producers of the country, which has overthrown the bourgeoisie. The more powerful enemy can be vanquished only by exerting the utmost effort, and by the most thorough, careful, attentive, skillful, and obligatory use of any, even the smallest, rift between the enemies, any conflict of interests among the bourgeoisie of the various countries, and among the various groups or types of bourgeoisie within the various countries, and also by taking advantage of any, even the smallest, opportunity of winning a mass ally, even though this ally is temporary, vacillating, unstable, unreliable, and conditional. Those who do not understand this reveal a failure to understand even the smallest grain of Marxism, of modern scientific socialism in general. Those who have not proved in practice, over a fairly considerable period of time, and in fairly varied political situations, their ability to apply this truth in practice, have not yet learned to help the revolutionary class in its struggle to emancipate all toiling humanity from the exploiters. And this applies equally to the period before and after the proletariat has won political power. Our theory is not a dogma, but a guide to action, said Marx and Engels. The greatest blunder, the greatest crime, committed by such out-and-out Marxists as Karl Kautsky, Otto Bauer, etc., is that they have not understood this and have been unable to apply it at crucial moments of the proletarian revolution. Quote, political activity is not like the pavement of Nevsky Prospect, the well-kept, broad and level pavement of the perfectly straight principal thoroughfare of St. Petersburg. N.G. Chernovsky, the great Russian socialist of the pre-Marxist period, used to say. Since Chernyshevsky's time, disregard or forgetfulness of this truth has cost Russian revolutionaries countless sacrifices. We must strive at all costs to prevent the left communists and West European and American revolutionaries that are devoted to the working class from paying as dearly as the backward Russians did to learn this truth. Prior to the downfall of Tsarism, the Russian Revolutionary Social Democrats made repeated use of the services of the bourgeois liberals, i.e., they concluded numerous practical compromises with the latter. In 1901 to 02, even prior to the appearance of Bolshevism, the old editorial board of Iskra, consisting of Plekhanov, Axelrod, Zasalich Martov, Potresev, and myself, concluded, not for long it is true, a formal political alliance with Stroeve, the political leader of bourgeois liberalism, while at the same time being able to wage an unremitting and most merciless ideological and political struggle against bourgeois liberalism, and against the slightest manifestation of its influence in the working class movement. The Bolsheviks have always adhered to this policy. Since 1905, they have systematically advocated an alliance between the working class and the peasantry against the liberal bourgeoisie and Tsarism, never, however, refusing to support the bourgeoisie against Tsarism. For instance, during second rounds of elections or during second ballots, and never ceasing their relentless ideological and political struggle against the socialist revolutionaries, the bourgeois revolutionary peasant party, exposing them as petty bourgeois democrats who have falsely described themselves as socialists. During the Duma elections of 1907, the Bolsheviks entered briefly into a formal political bloc with the socialist revolutionaries. Between 1903 and 1912, there were periods of several years in which we were formally united with the Mensheviks in a single social democratic party. But we never stopped our ideological and political struggle against them as opportunists and vehicles of bourgeois influence on the proletariat. During the war, we concluded certain compromises with the Kautskyites, with the left Mensheviks, Martov, and with a section of the socialist revolutionaries, Chernov and Natanson. We were together with them at Zimmerwald and Kianthal, and issued joint manifestos. However, we never ceased and never relaxed our ideological and political struggle against the Kautskyites, Martov and Chernov, when Natanson died in 1919, a, quote, revolutionary communist Narodnik. He was very close to and almost in agreement with us. At the very moment of the October Revolution, we entered into an informal but very important and very successful political bloc with the petty bourgeois peasantry, by adopting the Socialist Revolutionary Agrarian Program in its entirety, without a single alteration, i.e., we effected an undeniable compromise in order to prove to the peasants that we wanted not to steamroller them, but to reach agreement with them. At the same time, we proposed, and soon after effected, a formal political bloc, including participation in the government, with the left Socialist Revolutionaries, who dissolved this bloc after the conclusion of the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and then, in July 1918, went to the length of an armed rebellion, and subsequently of an armed struggle with us, against us. It is therefore understandable why the attacks made by the German lefts against the Central Committee of the Communist Party of Germany for entertaining the idea of a bloc with the Independents, the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, the Kautskyites, are absolutely inane, in our opinion, and clear proof that the lefts are in the wrong. In Russia, too, there were right Mensheviks, participants in the Kerensky government, who corresponded to the German Scheidemans, and left Mensheviks, Martov, corresponding to the German Kautskyites, and standing in opposition to the right Mensheviks. A gradual shift of the worker masses from the Mensheviks over to the Bolsheviks was to be clearly seen in 1917. At the first All-Russia Congress of Soviets, held in June 1917, we had only 13% of the votes. The Socialist Revolutionaries and the Mensheviks had a majority. At the Second Congress of Soviets, October 25th, 1917, old style, we had 51% of the votes. Why is it that in Germany the same and absolutely identical shift of the workers from right to left did not immediately strengthen the communists, but first strengthened the Midway Independent Party, although the latter never had independent political ideas or an independent policy, but merely wavered between the Scheidemans and the communists? One of the evident reasons was the erroneous tactics of the German communists, who must fearlessly and honestly admit this error and learn to rectify it. The error consisted in their denial of the need to take part in the reactionary bourgeois parliaments and in the reactionary trade unions. The error consisted in numerous manifestations of that, quote, left-wing infantile disorder, which has now come to the surface, and will consequently be cured the more thoroughly, the more rapidly, and with greater advantage to the organism. The German Independent Social Democratic Party is obviously not a homogeneous body. Alongside the old opportunist leaders, Kautsky, Hilferding, and apparently to a considerable extent, Crispien, Ledebour, and others. These have revealed their inability to understand the significance of Soviet power and the dictatorship of the proletariat, and their inability to lead the proletariat's revolutionary struggle. There has emerged in this party a left and proletarian wing, which is growing most rapidly. Hundreds of thousands of members of this party, which has, I think, a membership of some 750,000, are proletarians who are abandoning Scheidemann and are rapidly going over to communism. This proletarian wing has already proposed, at the Leipzig Congress of the Independents, 1919, immediate and unconditional affiliation to the Third International. To fear a, quote, compromise with this wing of the party is positively ridiculous. On the contrary, it is the duty of communists to seek and find a suitable form of compromise with them. A compromise which, on the one hand, will facilitate and accelerate the necessary complete fusion with this wing, and, on the other, will in no way hamper the communists in their ideological and political struggle against the opportunist right wing of the independents. It will probably be no easy matter to devise a suitable form of compromise. But only a charlatan could promise the German workers and the German communists an "easy" road to victory. Capitalism would not be capitalism if the proletariat pur sang were not surrounded by a large number of exceedingly motley types intermediate between the proletarian and the semi-proletarian, who earns his livelihood in part by the sale of his labor power, between the semi-proletarian and the small peasant, and petty artisan, handicraft worker, and small master in general, between the small peasant and the middle peasant, and so on. And if the proletariat itself were not divided into more developed and less developed strata, if it were not divided according to territorial origin, trade, sometimes according to religion, and so on. From all this follows the necessity, the absolute necessity, for the Communist Party, the vanguard of the proletariat, its class-conscious section, to resort to changes of tack, to conciliation and compromises with the various groups of proletarians, with the various parties of the workers and small masters. It is entirely a matter of knowing how to apply these tactics in order to raise, not lower, the general level of proletarian class consciousness, revolutionary spirit, and ability to fight and win. Incidentally, it should be noted that the Bolsheviks' victory over the Mensheviks called for the application of tactics of changes of tack, conciliation and compromises, not only before but also after the October Revolution of 1917. But the changes of tack and compromises were, of course, such as assisted, boosted, and consolidated the Bolsheviks at the expense of the Mensheviks. The petty bourgeois Democrats, including the Mensheviks, inevitably vacillate between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, between bourgeois democracy and the Soviet system, between reformism and revolutionism, between love for the workers and fear of the proletarian dictatorship, etc. The Communists' proper tactics should consist in utilizing these vacillations, not ignoring them. Utilizing them calls for concessions to elements that are turning towards the proletariat. Whenever, and in the measure that they turn towards the proletariat, in addition to fighting those who turn towards the bourgeoisie. As a result of the application of the correct tactics, Menshevism began to disintegrate, and has been disintegrating more and more in our country. The stubbornly opportunist leaders are being isolated, and the best of the workers and the best elements among the petty bourgeois Democrats are being brought into our camp. This is a lengthy process, and the hasty, decision, no compromises, no maneuvers, can only prejudice the strengthening of the revolutionary proletariat's influence and the enlargement of its forces. Lastly, one of the undoubted errors of the German lefts lies in their downright refusal to recognize the Treaty of Versailles. The more weightily and pompously, the more emphatically and peremptorily this viewpoint is formulated, by K. Homer, for instance, the less sense it seems to make. It is not enough, under the present conditions of the international proletarian revolution, to repudiate the preposterous absurdities of, quote, national Bolshevism, Laufenberg and others, which has gone to the length of advocating a bloc with the German bourgeoisie for a war against the Entente. One must realize that it is utterly false tactics to refuse to admit that a Soviet Germany, if a German Soviet Republic were to soon arise, would have to recognize the Treaty of Versailles for a time and to submit to it. From this, it does not follow that the independents, at a time when the Scheidemans were in the government, when the Soviet government in Hungary had not yet been overthrown, and when it was still possible that a Soviet revolution in Vienna would support Soviet Hungary, were right, under the circumstances, in putting forward the demand that the Treaty of Versailles should be signed. At that time the independents tacked and maneuvered very clumsily, for they more or less accepted responsibility for the Scheidemann traitors, and more or less backslid from advocacy of a ruthless, and most calmly conducted, class war against the Scheidemans, to advocacy of a classless or above-class standpoint. In the present situation, however, the German Communists should obviously not deprive themselves of freedom of action by giving a positive and categorical promise to repudiate the Treaty of Versailles in the event of Communism's victory. That would be absurd. They should say, the Scheidemans and the Kautskyites have committed a number of acts of treachery hindering, and in part quite ruining, the chances of an alliance with Soviet Russia and Soviet Hungary. We Communists will do all we can to facilitate and pave the way for such an alliance. However, we are in no way obligated to repudiate the Treaty of Versailles, come what may, or to do so at once. The possibility of its successful repudiation will depend not only on the German, but also on the international successes of the Soviet movement. The Scheidemans and the Kautskyites have hampered this movement. We are helping it. That is the gist of the matter. Therein lies the fundamental difference. And if our class enemies, the exploiters and their Scheidemann and Kautskyite lackeys, have missed many an opportunity of strengthening both the German and the international Soviet movement, of strengthening both the German and the international Soviet revolution, the blame lies with them. The Soviet revolution in Germany will strengthen the international Soviet movement, which is the strongest bulwark and the only reliable, invincible, and worldwide bulwark against the Treaty of Versailles and against international imperialism in general. To give absolute, categorical, and immediate precedence to liberation from the Treaty of Versailles, and to give it precedence over the question of liberating other countries oppressed by imperialism from the yoke of imperialism, is Philistine nationalism, worthy of the Kautskys, the Hilferdings, the Otto Bauers, and company, not revolutionary internationalism. The overthrow of the bourgeoisie in any of the large European countries, including Germany, would be such a gain for the international revolution that, for its sake, one can, and if necessary should, tolerate a more prolonged existence of the Treaty of Versailles. If Russia, standing alone, could endure the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk for several months, to the advantage of the revolution, there is nothing impossible in a Soviet Germany, allied with Soviet Russia, enduring the existence of the Treaty of Versailles for a longer period, to the advantage of the revolution. The imperialists of France, Britain, etc. are trying to provoke and ensnare the German communists. Say that you will not sign the Treaty of Versailles, they urge. Like babes, the left communists fall into the trap laid for them, instead of skillfully maneuvering against the crafty and, at present, stronger enemy. And instead of telling him, we shall sign the Treaty of Versailles now. It is folly, not revolutionism, to deprive ourselves in advance of any freedom of action, openly to inform an enemy who is at present better armed than we are, whether we shall fight him, and when. To accept battle at a time when it is obviously advantageous to the enemy, but not to us, is criminal. Political leaders of the revolutionary class are absolutely useless if they are incapable of changing tack or offering conciliation and compromise, in order to take evasive action in a patently disadvantageous battle. End of section.